So I'm going to switch gears a bit because so far we've been hearing talks very much on cases, but I will actually be talking about methodology I've been developing at Roche. So I work at Roche's drug safety department and as a data scientist. And basically our job is to support Roche's medical safety scientists in the questions they might have about anything related to drug safety. And a very typical question that we receive is that what is the baseline rate for a certain event in a certain patient population? The background for such a request can be that, for example, that they have observed adverse events in a clinical trial, and they want to really know if these adverse events are due to the disease they're trying to treat, or is it the drug that actually was given? And they want to know the reference rate. And we usually go to real-world databases to calculate this inference rate, to calculate these incidence rates. And these real-world databases are things like insurance claims databases, commercial ones, patient registries, and so forth. The problem here is that our safety scientists and those databases talk in two different languages. Our safety scientists describe the terms in metracodes, which is a medical vocabulary widely used in the drug development area, like at Roche. Whereas those databases, the event source databases, are encoded in vocabularies called ICD-9 and ICD-10. And what we really always have to do before we even start doing an analysis is to map those metra terms into ICD-9 and 10, which is, there are mapping tables available, but the problem is that only like 30 or 40% of the metra terms actually have a direct, even an approximate mapping to ICD. And then the safety scientists can come to us with hundreds of metra terms, which means that most of those have to be manually mapped. I have a few examples of metra terms here. For example, amnesia has a direct exact mapping to ICD. So in metra, you talk of amnesia. In ICD-9, you talk of memory loss. That's easy. Whereas we have an event called pulse absent. It has a mapping, but it's approximate. So it's been mapped to something like other specified symptoms, which is very inspecific, which can cover lots of different events. And there are also metra events like non-small cell lung cancer, which is the most common type of lung cancer, is that exactly, if you look at the mapping tables, it doesn't really have a direct mapping in ICD-9 and 10, which was actually pretty surprising. So, because I don't like doing all this manual mapping myself, so I was thinking that if there could be some kind of a machine learning-based approaches to actually help me and the safety scientists in doing the job. So I had the idea of trying to use word embeddings to help us here. So before I go actually further, I'm going to discuss briefly of what a word embedding is. So word embedding is actually just basically a way to represent words with a numerical vector as a function of the context the word appears in a larger text. So for example, you start with a large body of text called corpus, like all Wikipedia articles, all PubMed abstracts there are. And then you go through all these millions of documents. And for each word, you try to learn a numerical description. A very common algorithm for doing this is called word2vec. For example, it comes in two variants, SIBO and skipgram. For example, SIBO, you take the word you're interested in and the context it appears in. That's like 3-4 words in both directions in the text. And in SIBO, for example, your input in your neural net is the context the word appears in, and then you train the neural net to predict what is the actual word you're interested in. Whereas in skipgram, your input to the neural net is actually the word you're interested in, and what you want to predict is the context it appears in. And in the end, when you repeat this across all the words several times, across these millions of articles, you train weights in your model, and then you can use this trained model to calculate descriptors for your words. And then you can once you have these descriptors generated, you can do different things. You can use them as an input for machine learning. You can calculate distances between two words. And if those two words have the same context, same meaning, they should appear very close into space. So For my work, I took 2 text corpora. First was the Roche's drug safety database, which contains about 2 million drug safety reports, so free text that has been entered by a physician or somebody who has been reporting an adverse event for Roche drug. And another one was a database called Mimic3, which is a public database it contains something like 2 million patient notes from a public US hospital. So large data sets. And then before I started generating those word embeddings for the different METRA and ICD terms, I had to do some text pre-processing. So if you can look at the bottom box on the below, you can see that you remove very common words like te, on, and an, and you remove commas, parentheses, and so forth. And then you also pay close attention to the METRA and ICD terms that you want to have the word embeddings for. For example, I have here the non-small cell lung cancer. I have put it together. I have replaced the space characters with an underscore, so just to make sure that the algorithm treats it as a single word and not just 5-6 different words. So then you do this pre-processing, and then I use 3 different algorithms for doing the word embedding with different combination of parameters. And for each word, you generate a large set of vectors that you can then use for calculating distances for METRA and METRA terms to ICD terms. As my baseline, if you use a fancy methodology like this, you have to have a very simple baseline. As a baseline, I actually calculated a overlap of documents 2 terms appear in. So, for example, we have in red circles we have documents which contain the term X, which could be your METRA term, and then in the blue circle we have all the documents in your corpus which contain the term Y, which could be your ICD term. And we have A is the set of documents they both appear in, B is the where only the term X appears in, and the C is the where only the term Y appears in. And then you calculate a baseline distance for the 2 terms. So very straightforward, actually. And actually, I really wanted to these word embedding methods will outperform this simple baseline. Before I go to the validation results, I'm going to give you one example of what the neighborhood of a term looks like. So, for example, here I took the non-small cell lung cancer. And this is a METRA term. So I had a look what are the closest ICD-10 terms. And so as you can see, the terms I have highlighted here in green are all that have something to do with lung cancer. So it seems to be working. Seems to be that all makes sense. Interestingly, it also terms for pancreatic cancer also appear there pretty high on the list. And I was wondering, why is this? And I had a potential explanation is that the pancreatic cancer often metastatizes in the lung. So that's why those 2 terms, lung cancer and pancreatic cancer in medical text, have a similar context. Another example is for the pulse absent, which one of the first slides, it had a very approximate mapping, and which is not very useful if you want to do an epidemiology study. And basically, if you look at the closest ICD terms to pulse absent, is that you can see that a lot of different cardiac events appear here on the list, which can then, depending on the question you're trying to answer, you can then pick some of these to describe your pulse absent, the absence of pulse. I mean, many of them are very clear that you have coma. If you have no pulse, you might go into coma or brain dead. So all makes sense. Then to evaluate the performance of these different embeddings in mapping METRA and ICD, I took a table of 524 METRA terms for which mappings to both ICD-9 and ICD-10 were available. And for each of these METRA queries, METRA terms, I calculate their distance to both separately to the ICD-9, all the ICD-9 and ICD-10 terms. And I picked the top 50 from both lists, and I checked how often the all known mappings were in this top 50. And as you can see here in the results that, especially for ICD-9, if you use the fast text or the word-to-vec algorithm, your recall rate is around 90%, which is actually pretty good. So 90% for 90% of your METRA queries, you find the known true mappings within the top 50. And the gray bar is then for the baseline, so you can see it's also in almost all cases, these word embeddings outperform the baseline I described. And there's also, I tested the Clove algorithm, which is a bit different algorithm in red, and it's actually didn't perform as well as Word2Vec or fast text. And it's also interesting to know that the performance with against mapping to ICD-9 seems to work better than to ICD-10. This could be also because at least in the medical, especially ICD-9 has been used more longer time, especially in medical records than ICD-10. Maybe there's simply more training data available. And also interesting was that the choice of the corpus you use actually makes a really little difference. So as you can see, I have here on the left, you have the performance using when you train the embeddings with the Roche corpus. In the middle, you have with the mimic3. And if you then on the right, you have with the combined corpus, and it's pretty much, performance is pretty much the same with all of them. So to wrap up, I mean, I have described what I at least find a novel approach to mapping medical terminologies. And of course, there are also existing approaches, and this is really meant to complement. I mean, we already can map quite a lot of these terms, but the thing is that it's always helpful if you can increase the mapping at least somewhat. I mean, with the validation, I showed that these methods are able to find the known mappings, but you have to take this result with a grain of salt. I mean, as you could remember, the recall was 90%, and it almost sounds too good to be true. And I think you have to take this with basically a grain of salt, because of course these are the terms that have been already been manually mapped by somebody, and they probably are the easiest one to map. So the thing is that if you have meta term for which no mapping exists, it could be simply it's just not so trivial to map it. There is simply no matching term in ICD at all. So the thing is that this performance might be not so good when you actually use it. And finally, I mean, our goal is to build a company-wide tool to doing this term mapping. I mean, this would be basically our plan is to have a web page in our intranet where people can just go with their meta terms and see what are the ICD terms closest to them in the clinical space. I mean, this is of course the final decision then of which terms to map, how to map will be by the medical expert. And this is really would be a tool to complement other approaches. I think that's all I had, and I'm happy to take any questions. Thank you. Sure.
Have you thought of doing a topic analysis, like Roche or something, to see if there are if you could match the words with certain topics from these topics?
Match with certain topics, and how would you?
I'm not sure exactly, but you saw that some words were associated with some diseases or so maybe doing a topic analysis to find out what are the topics would be also a good metric.
Exactly. So that what are the other? Yeah, well, that would be almost like a machine learning approach. Maybe you could have a bunch of similar terms and you would train a supervised model with that. I don't. Yeah. Okay. No, I haven't. Of course, this is really the first version of the whole thing, so there are different things to try. Yes, please.
Well, have you applied it to any other data set, the mapping to MEDRA? You used it in the reports. I suppose these are the reports that come to Roche on adverse effects or something like that, right? That's your data set?
Yeah, that was the two data sets. So one was the Roche's safety database, that's basically what you described, and the other one was the release notes and patient notes from a public hospital in the US. Yeah. Okay. So there were two. Yeah, exactly.
Right. Okay,
so we have one in the back.
Thanks for the nice presentation. I'm just wondering if you use the unified medical language system to improve the result. Because actually, you can map all these standards and vocabularies with SNOMED city, which can be assumed as knowledge graph nowadays. And there is a similar work we have done at Stanford, which is using knowledge graph-based embedding for this. And also there is additional text-based embeddings through the web by
No, I haven't considered that. Of course, there must be so many ways of doing this. Yeah, thanks for the idea.
All right, we have to move on to the next talk.
All right, thank you.
Thank you.